Arrival at the outpost. The massive interstellar station, Outpost Orion, loomed above the gas giant Kilos 4, a shining beacon of cooperation between humanity and the galactic concord. As the shuttle docked with the station, Lieutenant Eric Caldwell stepped onto the landing bay, adjusting his uniform. His posting here was supposed to be a diplomatic security role, his first break from combat since the Serpent Nebula conflict. Commander Tobias Kane, a grizzled veteran with salt and pepper hair, greeted him with a firm nod. "Welcome to Orion, Lieutenant. It's not a war zone, but don't let that fool you, it has its own, unique dangers." Eric smirked. "After dodging plasma rounds in the nebula? I think I can handle a little diplomacy." Kane chuckled but leaned in slightly. "Ever worked alongside a Zalari before?" Eric frowned. The Zalari, a species of lithe, violet-skinned humanoids with piercing golden eyes. Known for their agility, intellect, and unusual mating cycles. "We've got one on staff, Lieutenant Saria Vex. Brilliant strategist." But, Kane hesitated. "She's entering pairing season soon. Their pheromones make them unpredictable. Just keep your door locked at night." Eric arched a brow. "Noted. I'll be sure to." A presence caught his attention. Across the bay, a tall, elegant figure in a sleek black uniform strode toward them. Golden eyes locked onto Eric, analyzing, measuring. Lieutenant Saria Vex. Her violet skin shimmered under the station's artificial lighting, and her dark indigo hair was tied in a long braid down her back. Her movements were fluid, predatory, like a panther watching its surroundings. "So this is the new security officer," she mused, voice smooth as silk. "Caldwell, right? A pleasure." She extended a three-fingered hand, her long nails painted with dark metallic polish. Eric shook it, noting the unexpected warmth of her skin. "Likewise. I hear we'll be working together closely." Her lips curled slightly. "Yes. Very closely." As she walked away, Kane exhaled. "That was tame," he muttered. "Give it a few days, and you'll understand why I told you to keep that door locked." Eric smirked. He had fought pirates, survived planetary sieges, he wasn't worried. But he should have been. A dangerous attraction. Eric settled into his new quarters, the sterile white walls and artificial gravity a stark contrast to the rugged battlefields he was used to. The station's hum was a constant reminder of its sheer size, a floating city in the void. His role as a security officer seemed straightforward enough: monitor protocols, ensure the safety of diplomatic personnel, and prevent any interspecies conflicts before they escalated. Easy enough, he thought. But something about Lieutenant Saria Vex lingered in his mind longer than it should have. His first full day on Outpost Orion was a whirlwind of briefings, equipment checks, and system orientations. The security team comprised a mix of humans and Concord species, each bringing their own approach to the delicate dance of diplomacy and enforcement. Despite their differences, they worked well together. Saria, however, was an enigma. She was sharp, calculated, and undeniably lethal in training exercises. Eric had seen her drop a fully armored trooper with nothing but a swift kick and a fluid twist of her wrist. There was a dangerous elegance to her movements, like a predator effortlessly playing with its prey. By the time his shift ended, exhaustion weighed on him like a lead blanket. His quarters were simple, Spartan, really. A bed, a terminal, a small personal storage unit. The environmental controls still needed adjusting, it was too warm for his liking. Stripping down to his undershirt and shorts, he sank onto the bed, running a hand through his damp hair. The station's artificial night cycle dimmed the lights, bathing the room in a soft blue glow. As he lay back, his mind drifted, but not to the reports he was supposed to review. Instead, he thought about Saria's golden eyes and the way they seemed to pierce right through him. Sleep came quickly. Somewhere in the dead of night, a subtle shift in the air woke him. A scent, something sweet, exotic, and utterly intoxicating, filled his lungs. His combat instincts flared, but before he could react, the mattress dipped beside him. Warmth pressed against his side, soft yet firm. He tensed, muscles coiling, but then a whisper brushed his ear. "You left your door unlocked." His eyes snapped open. The dim light revealed a silhouette beside him, long limbs stretched with predatory grace. His pulse hammered in his throat as he recognized Saria. She was out of uniform, clad in something dark and silken that clung to her body. Her golden eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, locked onto his with an intensity that made the air thick with tension. "What are you doing here?" His voice was hoarse, his body betraying him with its instinctive reaction to her presence. "You tell me," she murmured, tracing a slow finger across his chest. "You're the one who left the door open." His brain scrambled for logic, for protocol, but her scent clouded his thoughts. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered, heady, consuming, designed to disarm and ensnare. He knew about Solari pheromones, had been warned, but experiencing them firsthand was another matter entirely. "Saria," he ground out, willing himself to move, to create distance, but his body refused. She hummed, shifting closer, her breath warm against his skin. "I can feel your heart racing." "Interesting." Eric clenched his jaw, every fiber of his being warring with instinct and discipline. This was dangerous. This was reckless. And yet, he had left the door open. A line almost crossed. Eric forced himself to breathe slowly, to focus, but Saria's presence made it impossible. Every movement she made was deliberate, calculated. The thin silk fabric she wore barely concealed the firm curves beneath, her violet skin glowing faintly in the dim light. His mind screamed at him to regain control, to put distance between them, but his body, traitorous and responsive, refused to obey. She leaned in closer, her fingers tracing along his collarbone, light as a whisper. Her scent thickened, filling his lungs with something dangerously sweet. It was intoxicating, meant to dissolve resistance, meant to override reason. He had heard stories about Solari pairing cycles, about how their chemistry could drive them, and their chosen mates, to madness. But no one had ever told him how devastatingly difficult it was to fight it. "Saria," he managed, voice rough, trying to keep his hands at his sides. "You need to leave." Her golden eyes flickered with something unreadable, a mix of curiosity and challenge. "Do I?" she mused, tilting her head slightly. "Because I don't think you want me to." His jaw clenched. She wasn't wrong. Every instinct in him screamed to pull her closer, to let go of restraint. But that wasn't who he was. He had built a life on discipline, on control. He had fought through war zones, resisted the pull of fear and temptation alike. This had to be no different. With every ounce of willpower he had, he lifted a hand and placed it against her shoulder. A warning. A barrier. "This isn't happening," he said, his voice steadier this time. Saria stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she gave a soft, almost amused hum and leaned back slightly, breaking the unbearable tension between them. "Impressive," she murmured, golden eyes flickering with something close to admiration. "Most wouldn't have lasted that long." Eric exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. His body still hummed from her proximity, from the raw chemical pull between them. He needed space. Air. A cold shower, maybe. Saria, however, didn't seem the least bit affected. She stretched, languid and slow, her toned muscles shifting under smooth violet skin. "Your discipline is remarkable, Eric Caldwell. But you should know," she cast him a teasing smirk as she stood, her braids sliding over her shoulder. "This is only the beginning." She turned toward the door, and only then did he realize, he hadn't locked it. Again. With a flick of her wrist, she tapped the control panel, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. She stepped out, her scent still clinging to the air. Before leaving, she glanced over her shoulder, her gaze holding his for just a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Lieutenant." And then she was gone. Eric sat there in the silence, running a hand through his hair. He was in trouble. Big trouble. A dangerous game. The next morning, Eric forced himself to shake off the lingering effects of the night before. He had barely slept, his mind plagued by the memory of Saria's touch, her scent, the heat of her body against his. He had resisted her, but only barely. And that fact alone unsettled him more than he cared to admit. By the time he arrived at the Security Operations Center, the station had already begun its daily cycle. The steady hum of personnel moving through their shifts filled the halls. He needed the distraction. He needed something, anything, to push thoughts of Saria out of his mind. Commander Kane met him near the tactical briefing room, arms crossed. "You look like hell, Lieutenant." "Rough night," Eric muttered, adjusting his uniform. Kane smirked knowingly. "Ah. So, you understand now." Eric shot him a sharp look, but Kane just chuckled. "You're not the first officer who's found himself caught in a Zalari's pairing cycle, and you won't be the last." "I didn't," Eric started, but Kane cut him off with a raised hand. "I know. But you will need to be careful. The Zalari don't process attraction like humans do. It's not just desire, it's biological imperative. And if Saria's chosen you, it's not something she's going to let go of easily." That wasn't what Eric wanted to hear. The tactical briefing was routine, updates on minor security incidents, adjustments to station-wide patrol schedules, but his focus wavered. Across the room, Saria sat at the far end of the table, effortlessly poised, as if last night had never happened. But when their gazes met, something flickered in her golden eyes, something smug, knowing. She was toying with him. The realization sent a surge of frustration through him. Eric Caldwell had spent years mastering control, and he was damned if he was going to let himself become a pawn in a game he didn't even understand. When the briefing ended, he caught up to her in the corridor. "We need to talk." Saria arched a delicate brow. "Oh. About what?" He took a slow breath, keeping his voice even. "About last night." She hummed thoughtfully, tilting her head. "What about it?" His jaw tightened. "I'm not some conquest for you, Saria. I don't play games." Her golden eyes studied him, amusement dancing in their depths. Then, to his surprise, she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You think this is a game? You think I can control what my body demands?" For the first time, something raw edged into her voice, something unguarded. Eric hesitated. He had assumed this was all part of some calculated seduction, but what if it wasn't? What if she was fighting this just as much as he was? "Saria." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "This isn't easy for me either." A flicker of something crossed her expression, frustration, maybe, or something deeper. She exhaled sharply, stepping back. "I chose you, Eric. That wasn't an accident." His heart pounded. "Why?" She hesitated, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked uncertain. "Because you make it harder to control." And then she was gone, disappearing down the corridor before he could even process what she had just said. Eric stood there, his pulse hammering in his chest. This was far worse than he had thought. Breaking the boundaries. Eric spent the next few days avoiding Saria as much as possible. He buried himself in work, focusing on security drills, patrol shifts, and system diagnostics. Anything to keep his mind off of her. But no matter how hard he tried, he could still feel her presence, like a pulse beneath the surface of his thoughts. Every time she entered a room, his skin prickled. Every time their eyes met across the operations center, his breath caught for just a fraction of a second. She wasn't making it easy, either. Saria wasn't just present, she was watching him. Studying him. Testing him. Sometimes, when he passed her in the corridors, he could swear he caught the faintest hint of her scent, a deliberate reminder of what still lingered between them. A challenge. But Eric refused to be caught in her gravitational pull. At least, that was the plan. Late into the station's artificial night cycle, Eric was in the training hall, pushing himself harder than usual. The rhythmic pounding of his fists against the reinforced bag was the only sound in the otherwise empty room. Sweat dripped from his brow, his muscles burned, but he welcomed the pain. He needed something real, something grounding. You fight like a man trying to outrun something. His fists stilled mid-strike. He turned his head, already knowing who he would see. Saria leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching him. She had discarded her usual uniform for sleek, dark training gear that clung to her form. Her braid was slightly loosened, stray strands framing her sharp features. She looked like a warrior, poised, untamed. "You should be resting," he muttered, grabbing a towel to wipe the sweat from his face. "So should you." She stepped into the room, and he felt his entire body tense. The space between them suddenly felt too small. "What do you want, Saria?" Her golden eyes locked onto his, searching. "Answers." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "We've been over this. It's your pairing cycle." "It's more than that," she cut in, stepping closer. Eric stiffened. "Saria. I thought I could control it," she admitted, voice quieter now. "I thought I could override it with logic. But every time I fight it, it just strengthens." He swallowed hard. "You think I don't feel it too?" Her breath hitched, and for the first time, she looked conflicted. She took another step, now just inches away. He could see the faint shimmer of her skin, the way the golden patterns along her arms pulsed slightly. "Then why do you resist?" she whispered. Eric clenched his fists. "Because if I don't, I won't stop." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Saria reached up, resting her hand lightly on his chest. His heart pounded against her palm, betraying him. "Then stop fighting it," she murmured. And just like that, the fragile wall between them shattered. Before he could think, before he could question, his hands found her waist, fingers pressing into warm violet skin. She gasped softly as he pulled her against him, her body molding perfectly to his. Then, finally, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't hesitant. It was raw, unfiltered, inevitable. Saria melted into him, her arms curling around his neck as she deepened the kiss, her body pressing into his like she was meant to be there. Her scent wrapped around him, drowning him in warmth, in need, in something he had been denying for far too long. There was no stopping this now, the fire had been lit. And it was consuming them both. The point of no return. The kiss burned through Eric like wildfire, igniting something deep, something primal. Saria responded with equal intensity, her grip tightening as if anchoring herself to him. The space between them no longer existed, there was only heat, only sensation, only the raw pull of two beings colliding in ways neither of them had ever anticipated. Her breath hitched as his hands slid over her waist, fingers pressing into smooth violet skin, mapping the contours of her body like a soldier memorizing a battlefield. Every movement, every shift, sent shivers through them both. He felt her heartbeat, rapid and in sync with his own. But this wasn't just desire. This was something deeper. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a warning sounded, this wasn't just an attraction, not just biology. It was something far more dangerous. The realization made him pull back, his breath ragged. His hands still held her, but he forced himself to look her in the eyes, to search for the truth buried beneath the pull of chemistry. "Saria," he rasped. "This isn't just your pairing cycle, is it?" She was still catching her breath, her golden eyes flickering with something unspoken, something vulnerable. No, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. His grip on her tightened. What does that mean? She exhaled, pressing her forehead against his. It means that choosing you wasn't a mistake. It means that she hesitated, as if the words were unfamiliar. I don't think I can walk away from this. From you. Eric's pulse thundered in his ears. She wasn't just affected by her cycle, she was choosing him. Zalari weren't known for casual bonds. Their kind didn't form attachments easily, and when they did, it was rarely fleeting. A Zalari's choice in a mate was a commitment, a declaration, permanent. And she had chosen him. The weight of it pressed against him, undeniable, unrelenting. Saria, this changes everything. Her fingers brushed against his jaw, soft but certain. It was always going to change everything. He knew she was right. There was no going back now. No pretending this was temporary. But the universe didn't wait for them to figure things out. A sharp alarm blared through the training hall, red emergency lights flashing to life. The moment shattered, replaced by cold urgency. What the hell? Eric muttered, stepping back as his security instincts took over. Saria's expression hardened immediately, her golden eyes snapping toward the overhead display. A station-wide alert. Unauthorized docking detected. Someone's breached Outpost Orion. The heat of the moment evaporated in an instant. Eric was already moving, grabbing his gear, slipping back into the role of security officer instead of the man who had just crossed an irreversible line. Saria was right beside him, all traces of vulnerability replaced with sharp focus. They were soldiers first. And right now, the station needed them. Whatever had just happened between them would have to wait. Because something far more dangerous had just arrived. The choice that changed everything. Eric and Saria moved in unison through the dimly lit corridors of Outpost Orion, their footsteps sharp against the steel plating. The emergency sirens pulsed overhead, bathing the station in a flickering red glow. His pulse pounded, not from the fire that had burned between them minutes before, but from the tension that now gripped the air. As they neared the Security Operations Center, Kane's voice crackled through Eric's comm. Caldwell, Vex, report. We've got unauthorized vessels breaching Docking Bay 3. No distress signal, no response to hails. I don't like this. Eric pressed a hand to his earpiece. On our way. Are we looking at hostiles? Unknown. But given the lack of pleasantries, assume the worst. Eric exchanged a glance with Saria. Her golden eyes had darkened, her expression unreadable. She had gone from teasing and playful to pure, razor-sharp focus. A predator sensing a hunt. They reached the Security Command Center, where Kane stood over the holotable, watching grainy surveillance footage of the docking bay. The ship that had forced its way in was sleek, angular, and wrong. Its dark, jagged hull didn't match any known Concorde design. Eric's gut twisted. That's not a merchant vessel, he muttered. Kane nodded grimly. It's not sending any Concorde ID either. And we just lost internal feeds near the lower sector. They're already inside, Saria murmured. A burst of static cut through the comms. Then a garbled voice, one word distorted but clear enough to send ice through Eric's veins. Human. Eric met Kane's eyes. They're here for us. The enemy made their move before he could process it further. The explosion rocked the station, a deep boom that sent a tremor through the deck plating. Alarms shrieked, and the lights flickered as the power grid struggled to compensate. Eric instinctively grabbed the edge of the console to steady himself. They just breached Section D, a voice called over comms. They're armed, repeat, they are armed. Eric pulled his sidearm, locking eyes with Saria. We need to contain this before it spreads. She nodded, already reaching for her own weapon. But before they could move, Kane grabbed Eric's shoulder. Listen to me, Lieutenant. If they're here for humans, you're their primary target. You and every other human on this station. He turned to Saria. You need to keep him alive. Her expression darkened. I was going to do that anyway. There was no time for arguments. Eric and Saria sprinted toward Section D, the sounds of distant weapons fire echoing down the corridors. As they rounded a corner, they nearly collided with a team of security officers in heavy armor, their rifles primed. Lieutenant, we're pinned down. They came out of nowhere. The soldier didn't finish. A blur of black and silver moved faster than Eric's eyes could track. A shriek, something guttural, inhuman, cut through the air as the nearest guard was ripped backward into the shadows. A sickening crunch followed. Eric barely had time to react before the attackers emerged. Tall. Lithe. Not Solari, not Concord, not anything he recognized. Their armor clung to them like exoskeletons, segmented plates shifting unnaturally as they moved. Their eyes, jet-black voids, locked onto him with disturbing precision. Saria was the first to fire. Her shot struck the nearest attacker in the chest, but instead of collapsing, it barely staggered. It turned toward her, head tilting as if assessing her worth. Then it lunged. She dodged, barely, her body twisting with unnatural speed as she brought up her blade, a Zalari weapon, curved and pulsing with energy. The creature snarled, claws flashing toward her throat, but she twisted beneath its strike and buried her blade deep into its abdomen. Eric wasn't so lucky. The second attacker was on him in a blink, its clawed hand swiping toward his chest. He barely managed to block with his forearm, pain exploding through his body as the impact sent him sprawling. His weapon skidded across the floor. The creature loomed over him, exhaling something thick, hot, predatory. It grabbed his throat, lifting him as if he weighed nothing. Human, it hissed, its voice layered, inhumanly discordant. He struggled, fingers clawing at the grip around his neck, but his vision was darkening. Then, suddenly, Saria's scream shattered the air. It wasn't one of fear. It was rage. The weight on his throat vanished as the creature was ripped backward. Eric collapsed to the floor, gasping. Through the haze of his vision, he saw her. Saria stood over him, her body glowing, not just her golden eyes, but the patterns along her skin, pulsing brighter than he had ever seen. She turned toward the creature she had just thrown, her voice a low, furious snarl. You do not touch what is mine. The creature hissed, but there was something hesitant in its stance now. Something close to recognition. Eric struggled to push himself up. Saria, what? Not now, she cut in sharply. More creatures emerged from the shadows, their movements suddenly less aggressive, more calculated. As if reassessing the situation. Then, one by one, they began to retreat, melting into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. The alarm still blared. The damage to the station was still real. But the attackers, whoever they were, had withdrawn. Saria exhaled heavily, the glow in her skin slowly fading. She turned to Eric, kneeling beside him. Are you hurt? I'll live, he rasped, rubbing his throat. What the hell was that? She hesitated, looking down at her own hands, flexing her fingers. I don't know. But they knew what I was. And they knew what you were to me. Eric's breath caught at her words. Not a game. Not biology. Not a fleeting cycle. A choice. And whatever had just happened, it had changed everything. The sound of approaching security forces broke the moment, but Eric and Saria barely moved. Because both of them knew. This was far from over. It was only the beginning.